Welcome to Cobtree Manor Park, a lovely little recreational park on the outskirts of Maidstone. But today, where there is now relative peace and quiet, there was once something very different. Because for almost 3 decades, where I'm stood right now was a zoo. Now, it obviously doesn't look much like a zoo anymore, although if you peer behind me there is a slight hint at one of the few things that remain here that tell you what it used to be. And today, while I try and work my way around what would have been the old layout of the zoo here, which might be a little tricky because it's very different, we are going to tell the story of a place that brought happiness and joy to tens of thousands of people during a period where there, for parts of it, wasn't enough joy going around. And we're going to discover a little more about the incredible man who made it all happen. This is the story of Maidstone Zoo.
Hugh Garrard Tyrwhitt-Drake, or just Garrard to his friends, was a man from a long line of very well-connected, significant people, covering almost every industry the very well-off in Britain have covered for a very long time. Garrard, though, who was born in Maidstone on the 22nd of May 1881, was seemingly the son of the first Tyrwhitt-Drake to go into industry. His father, Hugh William, was one of the founders of the brewing business A.F. Style and Company. And it was in his early years, around 1896, that the family moved into the large country house known as Cobtree Manor. At the time, Cobtree had extensive grounds and was surrounded by vast orchards, which for Sir Garrard will of course come in very handy in a few decades. It seems Sir Garrard never really enjoyed school, although during his time there, he made his name as a pretty good horseman. An early indication that, as long as it involved an animal of some kind, he'd be into it. But despite his early anti-scholarly tendencies, he did go on to write 3 books about animals. And of course, did eventually gain international renown as a zoologist. And it was also through drawing animals that he found an ability and a certain talent for art. A talent that he would demonstrate throughout the rest of his animal-based career.
As is my tradition, I've parked a reasonable distance away from Cobtree Manor Park, which is where I need to go. As we speak, I'm currently walking over the A229. Where I'm coming down to right now, I believe, is not far away from the zoo's original car park. I'm just working my way down this road and I think this is the road that takes you into Cobtree Manor golf course. I'm not sure how much of this is the original road into the car park that would have been here. And I'm not sure how much of the clubhouse and the car park that's here now are, on where the original was. But it would have been about here, looking out onto the golf course behind me there. That must have been where the miniature railway ran to get to the zoo, which would have been basically in that direction somewhere. But as it doesn't look like I can walk straight across the golf course, and that's probably not a good idea anyway, I'm going to walk around it.
As happens surprisingly often when making these videos, I am very quickly about to find out that I am very wrong about where the car park was. But don't worry, you can make that discovery with me in a couple of minutes. When Sir Garrard was very young, one particular small gift would potentially go on to have a huge influence on what he would do with the rest of his life. He was gifted a model zoo, and went on to essentially continually and extensively run his small model zoo as if it were the full thing. And when he outgrew the model zoo, he was gifted some chickens. And it was from this moment on that his love affair with animals was clearly, fully instilled. And those chickens actually helped him get very, very involved with the county and the country's various chicken-based societies. And of course, his childhood love affair with animals led him often to the circus, which became another of his huge passions, and a kind of early door into where he'd end up. And it was through volunteering for various different circuses that he started to gain some real-world experience looking after circus animals. After finishing school, he went off to Argentina. A gap year of sorts was common for children of his class and status, but most of them went to Europe, not South America. Clearly, though, Sir Garrard had something of an idea of what he wanted to see in South America, that being the animals. And to his family's great surprise, when he came back, he wasn't alone. With him, he brought a small puma cub and a young, what I'm going to pronounce as Vizcacha. You can go ahead and slaughter me in the comments for that, but it was a small South American rodent. And from this point, Sir Garrard's huge collection of animals started to grow.
It is a shame that we can't retrace the steps of the thousands and thousands of people who, over that 26 years, made their way across the meadow from Chatham Road to the zoo, whether it was on foot or whether it was on the train. It would have been nice to, follow their footsteps as closely as I possibly could, but things change, zoos disappear, golf courses emerge. Well, on my walk around the golf course, I just come across this fun little chap and what appears to be a selection of fairies and fairy doors. I'd hope this is actually a deliberate little memento to the zoo, but I didn't think this is where I was going to find my first elephant, let's put it that way.
Throughout the years that followed, Sir Garrard started working for his father's brewing company, Style and Winch, which essentially became one of his main jobs throughout the rest of his life and career, alongside his political leanings, which we will get into later. But none of his professional commitments stopped him from adding to his collection of animals whenever he possibly could. His intense love of nature and animals is something that underlined every single part of his life. And by 1910, Sir Garrard's small collection of exotic animals and the occasional chicken had become the second largest private collection in England. And it was in these pre-war years that he actually started to open his collection to the public for the first time. Though not quite a proper zoo yet, members of the public could arrive between 2:30 and 4:30 PM on Wednesday afternoons. Entrance would cost you sixpence, and from a certain point, Sir Garrard started donating that money to West Kent General Hospital, which, when you're already living in a huge country manor and you don't necessarily need the money, is a very nice gesture, I think. 1912 also saw his full introduction into political life when he was first elected as Mayor of Maidstone, something that he would actually go on to be 12 times. And clearly not deterred by his sudden commitments to the local community, his collection continued to grow and grow until in 1913 he had the largest private collection of animals in the country, which included 6 lions, 4 bears, 8 wolves, 2 camels, 1 vulture, a bunch of sheep, a bunch of goats, and a lot of birds. And clearly deciding that it was finally time to go pro, Sir Garrard formed a private company to set up a zoo at a place called Towville Court. Not quite Cobtree Manor, but only a few miles down the road. He was joined by a man called George Thornycroft. Everything was organised, cages and paddocks were installed, and by the spring of 1913, 250 animals were moved into Towville Court Zoo. And then something went wrong.
Okay, so like all good documentarians, I'm going to slightly change the story halfway through here. Where I said the old car park and entrance was where the clubhouse to the golf course is, I actually don't think it was. So I've seen online photos of people heading to what is supposedly the old entrance gatehouse. But today, that isn't in the golf course. That is on the other side of the dual carriageway. It's actually on the junction off of Chatham Road onto Forstall Road. So I can't get to it, and it's actually next to a Scania depot. But looking at it from above, looking at Google Maps, you can see the remains of an old building, and you can see a lake next to it, which marries up with the descriptions of the site. There was a big lake at the entrance, and there would have been a gatehouse for getting your tickets, etc. So actually, from about here, just across from that on the other side of Forstall Road and the Chatham Road junction, this is more likely to have been where the footpath and the railway line started from.
Quick interruption here. As you can see, when I got the drone up to go and see what I could see of that old gatehouse and the lake and everywhere the car park used to be, it's clear that at some point in the last in the last few years, that gatehouse has been completely removed and there's nothing there anymore. Which is a real shame. I know it was derelict, obviously, and serving ultimately no purpose. You couldn't even get to it, really. But it's just another little piece of this history that's disappeared. Fortunately, I'm about to find something that does still exist, but only just.
I wish we had some evidence of that. I wish there were old tracks here. There was just something, anything. I mean, that could, what I'm looking at here, could be the remains of the old path coming across. I mean, it's tenuous at best. I'm stretching here, but actually, from this corner of the golf course on, is possibly where the actual footpath was. This is what making history videos on the internet is all about. Continuously self-correcting. You know what? I think this is it. So it's not the easiest to see here, but crossing the path that now runs around the outside of the golf course, there is a concrete path, like really, really sketchy remains of a concrete path cutting across from this side to this side. And you see behind me here, there was a path that used to carry on straight through here. With a fence alongside it, it gets to, you know, about here. It's only a few metres. You know, the path essentially ceases to exist. But I've had a quick look at Google Maps, and if that gatehouse on the other side of the road was the original entrance where the car park was, and the station, this lines up perfectly if you were going to travel from there to where the entrance to the actual zoo would have been. So this is it. This has got to be it. Yeah, this has to be the old entrance path. It's mad. For almost 3 decades, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people walked this abandoned, decrepit, overgrown path that I'm on now. And, for a large portion of that, a little train ran alongside as well. What I wouldn't give to be able to uncover just a little bit of track or something, but they probably pulled all that up.
Now, those of you that have been tracking the dates very carefully will probably have quite a good idea what was about to go wrong for Sir Garrard. Amongst various other difficulties, the outbreak of the First World War threw a bit of a curveball their way. And before it could even really get going, Tyrwhitt Court Zoo was closed. Fortunately, only being a little way down the road from Cobtree Manor, all of the animals went back there. Now, with the war in full swing, the idea of looking after and maintaining 250 animals without paying customers coming into a zoo to see them became a bit of a non-starter. And so Sir Garrard sailed off to the Bronx Zoo in New York, where he sold a huge portion of his animals before returning to England. Garrard couldn't help himself though, and he did also buy an elephant not long after selling half of his animals. That elephant, Jumbo, though unfortunately didn't last long at Cobtree Manor, contracting pneumonia and passing away in 1916. But of course, Jumbo would not be Sir Garrard's last elephant. Now, if you're thinking, is that all Sir Garrard did during the war? Just, sail around and sell animals, buy elephants? No, he actually served for the Veterinary Corps and spent time in Wales tending to service animals. A time which would probably go on to serve him incredibly well for the later zoo, because he got to learn how to treat various different injuries and sicknesses. and of course spent his time sketching the various animals that he came across while he was there. During the post-war years, right up until 1934, he spent his time running various menageries, taking his animals to places like Crystal Palace and Margate to do various shows. The entire time kind of teasing the idea of setting up a new zoo. But while he was young enough and his animal collection wasn't too huge, he could spend his time living the circus life, travelling the country and showing off his incredible animals. He even opened his own travelling circus in 1922, Garrard's Royal Circus. And in 1925, Sir Garrard got married. His new wife, Miss Edna Mary Vine, didn't necessarily love animals as much as he did, but she kind of put up with them for the rest of her life. There was nothing that was going to dissuade Sir Garrard from his animal ventures, so she just supported him. Now, of course, through this entire period of time when he was travelling the country with his animals, he obviously kept collecting more, and so eventually, by around 1932, his collection had gotten pretty big again. So big that the travelling life was becoming way too expensive and not very practical. And thus, the idea of opening a zoo started to float around in Sir Garrard's head once again. He was joined by a very new and competent keeper known as Captain Gates, and finally feeling like his collection was too big, but he had the staff and the grounds to possibly now actually handle a real zoo, things started to happen very quickly. The entire area around Cobtree Manor was transformed into paddocks and enclosures. A new car park was even added, when not really many people actually had cars. And by the afternoon of Monday the 29th of March 1934, Kent Zoo Park was ready to open.
Well, it looks like I've come about as far as I can, and the perimeter path around the golf course carries on down there, but I think up there behind me is Cobtree Manor, Sir Garrard and Lady Edna's old residence. A shame we're not going to be able to get any closer, but let's be real, that's not what anyone's actually here to see.
Okay, I'm now basically at the golf course alongside the manor. And continuing with my where's the old path theme, there is this odd section of fence here which looks almost like a small kind of enclosure with an opening on one side here. And I check Google Maps again, and it looks like this lines up with the rough direction of that path again. So I think there is a very good chance that this little enclosure behind me here was the zoo end train station. The people would have disembarked in the middle here behind me and then come out of this gap here on the fence and then continued their walk up here behind me to the main entrance to the zoo. Not obviously 100% that that's what that is, but it's a weird bit of fence to be anything else, so it's tiny, tiny little signs of what used to be here. Alright, so let's work the rest of the way to the zoo. We're here.
The opening ceremony for the zoo was performed by the famed Bertram Mills. And if you've never heard of Bertram Mills, he was the owner of the most famous circus in the country. And at the ceremony, he was accompanied by the great and the good of Maidstone. After the ceremony, all of the main guests were treated to a little tour around the park, followed by tea in the manor house with Garrard and his wife. A tradition that would go on to be repeated at every opening ceremony that followed. The weekend that followed the opening weekend was the Easter holiday, and that 4-day holiday saw more than 13,900 tickets sold. And apparently on the Easter Monday, no less than 300 cars were parked in that car park, which is an insane number of cars for that time period. And despite this huge number of visitors, completely overwhelming catering, nobody really seemed to mind and everybody kind of got into the spirit of things. By the time the zoo opened, it had a huge collection of animals to begin with. There were lions, tigers, a laughing hyena. There was even a polar bear called Trousers. There were wolves, baboons, monkeys. And then on top of that, all the smaller animals and birds. For Sir Garrard and his keepers, this opening proved to be a massive success.
Now, according to the old map, and assuming I've been able to marry things up correctly, I'm currently stood alongside the waterfowl pond, which was just alongside the actual main entrance where you would have come into the zoo, which, according to the map, would have been about here, where I'm standing. This, what is now just hedges and the very edge of Cobtree Manor, was apparently the main way in. It is very hard to tell that now. I mean, look, they've got an awesome treehouse. Don't think that would have been here. This must have been completely different. Looking at the map, this would have been a thoroughfare, basically a walk through here, and it looks like before you actually pass the waterfowl, the way into the zoo would have come round to the right here, basically through this. And then there would have been some enclosures, I think some aviary, some bird enclosures, some small animal enclosures just down there before the waterfowl pond. Now though, not a single sign of what this used to look like. Although actually, I don't know, I look like a complete weirdo doing this, but through there is actually a small building with a sign on it, an old sign that says Beefeater Tavern. And I am wondering if that was an original sign from one of the catering places in the zoo that they've repurposed and put on what looks like a small outhouse. I mean, even that outhouse could possibly have been an old ticket house, gatehouse, something at the entrance. That could be original. It doesn't look too new, so maybe there's a little sign of what used to be here there.
Having roughly mapped out where that, what I think is the original path, would have arrived, it makes a lot more sense that that might actually be one of the kind of gatehouse entry buildings that first greeted people when they arrived.
Only a few weeks after the zoo opened, tragedy struck. Of course, apart from the main keepers, a lot of the workers at the zoo were made up of young school leavers who acted as assistants going and cleaning the enclosures and the cages. One of those was 16-year-old Frederick Cashford. His role on this particular day was cleaning out the bear cage, and to do this he would pass a rake under the bars of the cage from outside and sweep up whatever he could reach. Of course, assistants and the younger members of staff were not actually allowed to go into the cages. On this particular occasion, there was some muck that he just couldn't reach, and Sir Garrard himself told him to not worry about it, leave it, we'll deal with that later. It was only a few moments later, whilst having a conversation with George Thornycroft, that both he and Sir Garrard suddenly heard an ear-splitting scream from the direction of the bear enclosure. And the scene they discovered must have been terrifying. Frederick Cashford was thrust up against the bars of the cage, with his right arm thrust through the bars into the cage, and his right hand locked in the bear's razor-sharp teeth. What followed was an incredibly desperate attempt to force the bear to release its grip on Cashford's hand. But the bear was not going to release his prize quickly or easily. And by the time they successfully forced the bear back, Cashford's entire right arm had been terribly, terribly mauled. And it actually done significant damage to his left hand as well in trying to pry the bear's jaws apart. Once freed, Frederick Cashford was rushed to hospital, where his right arm had to be amputated above the elbow. Unfortunately, despite a successful operation, septicemia set in, and after a brave fight, Frederick Cashford passed away from heart failure. In the following inquest, a verdict of accidental death was reached, and it was never really understood how Cashford had ended up in the position he was that close to the bars. The bear itself, which had never previously caused any trouble, actually remained at the zoo and never actually caused any more problems the entire time it was there. Apparently Sir Garrard was of course devastated by the loss of Cashford, but where you might think people would be put off from coming to the zoo after this incident, it seemed to actually quite morbidly be good for business, with people rushing to the zoo to see the bear who had mauled the boy.
Right, so I am currently stood between what used to be the entrance just over there and the waterfowl pond, and behind me here, the elephant house. Now apparently here, where there are just now some bushes, were the bears, and along with their enclosure was the actual bear pit. Now supposedly that would have been roughly, where I'm standing right now, and there is just not a single sign of anything even. Hang on, bear with me. We might actually be onto something. Hang on. Okay, no, maybe not. Just some beehives. Thought we were onto a bear pit there for a second, but no such luck. Does make me wonder though whether, similar to my Rocherville Gardens video, go watch that. That was really interesting. There's a bear pit there as well, and they discovered the foundations of that when they were building a new housing estate on top of it. So I wonder, when they were removing everything, whether they just buried the bear pit and whether there's a chance that it is still under all this soil and foliage here somewhere. If somebody out there has any clue what happened to that, whether they did just bury it, then do let me know, because it'd be fascinating to know if that is still beneath my feet right here.
In the first 7 weeks that the zoo had been open, they'd had 28,000 visitors and 2,400 cars had parked in that car park. Again, remember, that whole cars thing is quite significant because having a car was the exception, not the rule. And eventually, by the end of the zoo's first operating year, over 87,000 people had arrived. What followed was keen expansion. During the first winter closure, a new reserve called Wolf Wood was in place, along with a new small mammal house. Catering facilities were extended, bears were provided with new enclosures. Near Wolf Wood, a new aquarium was added, and Trousers the polar bear got a new pool. And Sir Garrard's famous Royal Cream ponies became a huge attraction for the visitors to the zoo, and these ponies could be seen every Christmas pulling the pantomime carriage. Why were they royal? Because 2 of Sir Garrard's stallion's ancestors had actually been presented to Queen Victoria, and apparently she'd used them to pull her bath chair around the royal gardens. So, of course, henceforth, every single ancestor of those 2 horses was a royal cream.
What is nice is that, even though, apart from the elephant house, nothing of the original zoo really still exists, that we do still have little reminders that have been put in of what was here. All of the play areas have been kind of zoo themed. Even the new cafeteria down next to the car park is named after Sir Garrard. There's so much value in that. There's so much value in remembering our history. It sounds basic, but it's very true. Well, here you go. Behind me is the 2026 version of Maidstone Zoo. A little quieter now than it used to be, I should think, but I can imagine in a few hours' time when the kids start to arrive, this will be just as loud as the old zoo used to be. Probably worse.
For the opening of the 1936 season of the zoo, a new elephant house was installed, though the elephants hadn't actually arrived by the time the zoo opened. A couple of months later, those Burmese elephants finally arrived, though what he'd expected were a pair of 4-foot-high Burmese elephants. What he got were two 5'6" high 6-year-olds, which, both weighing 1.5 tons, were too heavy for the lorry to get them to the zoo. But once they'd bodged their way to a slightly wider, definitely bodged, not road legal lorry, they managed to get them there. At which point a new problem arose, and they realised that a small wooden shed was not going to be big enough for two 1.5 ton elephants. And so despite only having just built this brand new elephant house, they had to build another one. Once they were safely installed, the two elephants were christened as Gert and Daisy, and would go on to become two of the most famous animals at the zoo. It was actually around this time that Sir Garrard was knighted, driving his distinctive yellow Rolls-Royce up to Buckingham Palace for the event. And he was actually one of the few people to be knighted by King Edward VIII during his very, very brief reign. Meanwhile though, it was becoming very clear that the zoo was in need of one major upgrade.
People got a bit tired of using the old beam poles to get here. And so Sir Garrard came up with an innovative new idea.
It had been a couple of years, and I'm pretty sure Sir Garrard had had enough complaints from people about walking all the way from the main entrance and the car park to the zoo itself. And so, picking up some spare track from a local quarry, Sir Garrard installed a miniature railway. One station was called Chatham Road, and the other station was called the Zoo. As well as providing a slightly more relaxing trip from the car park to the zoo for the guests, it also functioned as a new income stream for the very savvy Sir Garrard, who charged a not crazy fee of 2p for an inward journey to the zoo and 1p out. For those of you who are train inclined, it was a 2-foot gauge railway that ran for about 500 yards. It was operated by one locomotive, which was a 6W type with a petrol engine and steam outline body. It had a 14 horsepower Morris engine and drew 2 carriages mounted on bogie frames, each accommodating about 18 adults. The Sheerness Times reported, "A new and useful attraction is a miniature railway which runs from the Chatham Road to the zoo entrance, just over 1/4 mile. This addition will no doubt appeal to the juveniles for its novelty, and those of more mature age for its utility in saving Shanks's pony." For those of you that don't know what Shanks's pony means, it basically just means walking instead of using a vehicle. And the Cambridge Dictionary tells me that if somebody asks you how you are getting to a destination and you tell them that you are taking Shanks's pony, it means you're walking on your own 2 legs. And at the same time the miniature railway was installed, a model village was also put in. And if you ask me, the UK is seriously lacking model villages. There was a time where a model village would just be shoved into every attraction, no matter what. And they're sadly disappearing. I think we need more model villages out there. Consider this my call out to the UK entertainment establishment for more model villages. I want to feel like a giant again. One reasonably common theme throughout the existence of this zoo was the Royal Navy just kind of happening upon animals and then being like, well, we've ended up with a tiger on the boat, we need to do something with it. So the Royal Navy almost became a bit of a middleman for Sir Garrard to gather certain new animals. And the same year that the miniature railway and the model village and the various other things were put in, the crew of HMS Kent, while on station out in the Far East, had found a tiger. They'd called him Tiger Tim and brought him back to Chatham. Obviously not really having much use for a tiger in the Royal Navy or aboard the boat, they gave him to Sir Garrard. In 1938, HMS Emerald wound up with a pair of lion cubs, which they also presented to Sir Garrard. By the end of the 1936-1937 season, over 110,000 people had visited the zoo. So, where I'm walking now is just down from the waterfowl pond. Obviously one of the only landmarks I can really use to kind of gauge where I am. And around here was the famous Goat Rock, along with monkey cages, birds, but also this is where the Lion and Tiger Terrace would have been. And of course, there's nothing here anymore. Walking down alongside Forstall Road from where the Lion and Tiger Terrace would have been in this corner here was one of the most popular parts of the zoo, at least for people of a smaller stature, shall we say. I'm not talking about the monkeys, I'm talking about the kids.
This, all along here, would have been Pet's Corner.
Pet's Corner, or the Children's Zoo, was a nice little feature for the kids. It featured a lot of different small and domesticated animals, so this is where your cats, your rabbits, all of your household pets were kept. This was also possibly one of the best areas to see some of Sir Garrard's famous mural work in the zoo, and he'd painted the surrounding walls with various different scenes from Alice in Wonderland. And this obviously being where the kids were, there was a nice little cafe and a small kiosk put up very nearby.
And it's not completely unoccupied. There are still rabbits here. And there's a good picture of Pet's Corner. That would have been one that I would have loved to have been able to line up exactly, but there's just no way. I think there's a good chance you could drop off Sir Garrard anywhere in the park, except for maybe next to the elephant house. And even he wouldn't recognise where he was. And all this down from Pet's Corner would have been small mammal enclosures. This is where all the smaller animals were, and not a clue.
The elephant house we see here today was built in the winter of 1938. Gert and Daisy were now definitely outgrowing their old home, and so the large concrete structure that exists here today was put in place. The doors at either end were kept open during the summer, and so the visitors had the option to kind of just walk straight through the elephant house. And the area outside the back of their house was a large area of orchard where they could roam and exercise. So don't worry, they weren't holed up in here the entire time. And potentially just having, an excess of concrete left over, they decided to put in a proper bear pit as well. And this was your classic bear pit, similar to the bear pit that I've mentioned at Rocherville Gardens in Gravesend. It was a circular concrete depressed pit in the ground with a pole or tree or some kind of structure sticking right up in the middle for the bear to climb up. People could get a good view of the bear, and the bear could climb right up to eye level, but couldn't get anywhere near the people. Sadly, around the same time that this new elephant house had been built, one of the other elephants kept at the zoo, an elephant called Sally, passed away.
Well, here it is. The elephant house. Behind me is the building that was a home to Gert and Daisy and the other elephants that lived here for, almost 20 years. It's obviously been kind of done up a couple of times. This hasn't remained untouched. But this really, apart from, a few nebulous little things, is the main remaining evidence of what this place used to be. And I know this mural on this side has been here for some time, which tells you, see, some of the names of some of the famous animals that were kept here. There's Martha the chimp, I think Joey, well, it says Joey the penguin, but I know there was Joey the wallaby here as well. And, yep, around this side, we've got Gert and Daisy with Sir Garrard in between. If you've looked up any photos of the zoo or what remains here, this is what you'll see. And yep, just here, this would have been Gert and Daisy's door. The public wouldn't have actually had access to this side of things. Basically where I'm stood now, you were kind of starting to be pretty much outside the zoo. So talk about these orchards where Gert and Daisy could go and do their exercise, that was here. This was Gert and Daisy's, this was all the elephants, this was their home, this was their place to relax. When they were walking around the zoo and when they were in the elephant house, they were on show. But when they came out this side, this was their exercise, their relaxation place. So for members of the unwashed masses, this would have been their way in. This would have been where you came to see the elephants. If you walk down this path, it looks like they just use the actual elephant's door in to get in and out now. But originally, where it was just this plywood, lovely little painting of Sir Garrard here, you would have walked in through this door here, through the inside. I know this used to say Elephant House, but you would have come in through here. Inside, like I'm sure some zoos now, you would have had a railing between you and the elephants. You would have walked through the inside, said hello, and come out here, where again, it looks like more recently the door has been removed. You said goodbye to Gert and Daisy and carried on with your trip. It is very, very hard to stand here now and picture elephants, you know? It's a little sad, if I'm honest. It's a little sad to stand here and think of what this place once was. Not just an incredible attraction for people, tens of thousands of people to come and visit, but you know, a home. This was a home to so many animals. Some of them stayed here pretty much their entire lives, and now this is all that remains. Yeah, there's something both very nice but a little melancholy about that.
In August 1938, all of the main cages were floodlit, and quite tastefully, fairy lights had been strung along the trees around all the footpaths. And so all of a sudden, the zoo could remain open until about 10 or 10:30 at night. And having done night visits to zoos, I highly recommend it. It is a completely different experience. It's very, very cool. And if you're worried about how the animals reacted to these very late working hours, apparently none of them seemed to mind, apart from one chimp called Albert. Unfortunately, however, this lighting was only in place for 1 year. It's not sure whether it was just deemed too expensive, but regardless, this was 1938, and we all know that something very, very bad was about to happen.
Now I'm stood here just alongside the elephant house trying to line up a shot to match one of the original photos from the zoo here, which was looking up past the camel enclosure, the parrot house, and to the aquarium beyond, with lots of goats running through. And it's just impossible. It really doesn't seem like, you know, that much time has passed. It has. And not in the big scheme of things, but a lot of time has passed, and we know how quickly things can change. But it is just, it always hits home how, you know, somebody could have stood here not that long ago and just had a completely different view to what I'm seeing now.
Well, here are these commemorative gates that were installed after the zoo had actually closed, and obviously we know that this is not actually the entrance. This is not where you would have come in. It is now, because in the modern park we've got basically the car park for the modern park over there, the play area, everything on that side. This was nothing to do with the zoo. This was, I think, still just part of the estate, part of the orchards. This wasn't the zoo. Everything beyond these gates was where the zoo stood. Nobody would have ever actually come down here beyond, you know, possibly the animals and the keepers. But it is nice that, albeit on the wrong side, you still know now when you've officially crossed that threshold into the zoo.
Now, I have actually seen that, at least at some point in the last few years, it was possible to see some of the actual original animal graves. There was a little, you know, almost like a pet cemetery somewhere around here. Now, I've not seen anything that kind of pinpoints exactly where it is, but we're going to see if we can find it. All right, well, at first I got quite excited about stumbling across this in the woods, although I saw these big metal loops and thought, you know, they must have tethered animals on whatever this is, but I think there's more chance that it's just a giant cesspit. Starting to realise here that a good portion of my day is probably going to be spent walking around these woods for graves that no longer exist. If we can find them, though, I don't know, be interesting? Well, no graves yet, and I'm pretty sure if I keep walking in this direction, I will inadvertently stumble into Wolf Wood, which, you know, knowing my luck, I'll be the first guy in half a century to trip over and awaken a very, very old, very angry hibernating wolf. Nah. Alright, according to the map, I'm pretty sure I am definitely now in Wolfwood. So somewhere around here, it's possibly where Princess Liz was walking around biting her tongue, desperately trying not to mention the leaves.
More on that in about 8 years. But first, war. Now, Sir Garrard was obviously somewhat familiar with a war impacting one of his zoos, with his Toville Court Zoo being somewhat unfortunately affected by the First World War. But when on the 3rd of September 1939, Great Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, things came to an abrupt halt once again. All places of entertainment were closed, and for zoos across the country, they all had to be thoroughly inspected, with the risk of cages and enclosures being damaged during air raids a huge problem, and the last thing Britain needed was dangerous animals running around the countryside. But Cobtree turned out to be in quite a good position. Officials found that all of the enclosures and cages were solid enough that they weren't too worried about damage or escapees. And there were also no poisonous reptiles being kept there. So, roughly 10 days after war was declared, the zoo was allowed to reopen. And for the first year or so, nothing really slowed down that much. In fact, Sir Garrard was picking up more animals than he had before because the war had actually made animal prices cheaper. Only a lion, which would have cost before anywhere between £50 and £100, could now be got for about 10. And Sir Garrard actually got himself a new elephant. He bought a 15-year-old Indian elephant called Lizzie, who amazingly had a best friend in the form of a little Shetland pony called Danny. And Lizzie and Danny, who were actually in Wales with a circus, actually made the whole journey from Wales to Kent on foot. Not something you'd really expect to see in 2026, a huge Indian elephant and a little Shetland pony making their way around the M25. In 1939, war wasn't the only thing worrying Sir Garrard. One particular Saturday, a pair of Reese's monkeys managed to find a weak spot in the roof of their cage. A weak spot that they managed to turn into a large hole. Their great escape took them towards the River Medway. During their little absence, apparently they were spotted at a dairy farm, they popped into an inn at Allington Lock, and weren't actually spotted and cornered until they'd reached a place called Sandling Farm, where apparently they were kind of bothering the chickens. At which point, apparently what took place was a bit of a long standoff, where bait was laid and the monkeys kind of took their time deciding whether they were going to go for it or not. But by the evening of the same day, both monkeys had succumbed and were safely returned to the zoo, at which point some serious repairs and checks took place in all of the enclosures in the zoo. They, however, would not be the last escapees. And everything seemed to kind of carry on as normal. The zoo proved a nice distraction, at least for the first year or so, for members of the public who were obviously unable to find much entertainment anywhere else. And the Royal Navy continued to prove to be a good supply of animals, this time though tending to pick them up from sunken German merchant ships rather than the Far East. It was also not long after Lizzie the elephant had arrived that she proved to be a bit of a troublemaker. Because of the war, magazines, leaflets, pamphlets, all that kind of thing were kind of restricted. You couldn't just publish whatever you wanted anymore. And so, publicising, marketing the zoo became a bit of a problem. Lizzie, however, was chosen to become something of a walking advertisement for the zoo. But on one particular trip to Maidstone, she made it through the entire day, everything seemed to be going fine, until the journey back. Heading towards one of the rear entrances to the zoo, she decided not to go in. She just carried on walking, but knowing that the main entrance was just a bit further up the road, so she'd probably go in there, it'd be fine, they weren't too worried. But when they reached the main entrance, again, Lizzie wasn't having any of it. You can see how, having had a wonderful trip from Wales to Kent, she was probably like, well, I don't want to be holed up in there anymore. There's countryside for miles and miles. I'm going for a walk. And so, after a very, very long meander around the Cobtree estate and the local area, eventually, as evening set in, Lizzie decided to go home and finally made her way back to the elephant house to be reunited with Gert and Daisy. As the months went on, the zoo suddenly started to notice that things were getting a bit more difficult. Meat rationing had come in, which would obviously have a huge impact on feeding the animals, especially the carnivores, who obviously needed meat and needed quite a bit of it. And so even the animals had to start rationing, and Sir Garrard and his staff became reliant on a lot more donations than they had before. And eventually it became illegal to import new animals from abroad, and so the zoo had to rely on its own natural animal production, shall we say. Animals continued to be born at the zoo, and actually with many, many people heading out to help the war effort, a lot of animals, the more exotic ones really, were being left alone, and so many of those ended up at Cobtree. One of those animals that no longer had a home to go back to was a parrot. Its owner had apparently been struggling to find food for it, and so decided it was best off with Sir Garrard. Now, apparently, where a lot of parrots might just say, "Hello, Polly, give me a cracker," this one had clearly been in, let's say, less well-spoken company. And apparently all it did was swear like a blinder. And eventually this parrot was moved from the zoo to Sir Garrard's private aviary at the manor house, for fear of anyone taking offence. Although I think people might have just found it quite funny. And this parrot wasn't the only wartime arrival at the zoo, for another who had apparently spent 5 days buried in the rubble of its former home, arrived at the zoo uttering nothing but the fact that his name was Freddy. Nobody was ever able to find out anything about the owner or whether the owner had indeed survived. All they knew is that he came from somewhere in the south. But Freddy went on to have a great existence at the zoo and took up residence in the parrot house. For a while, things carried on like this, with staff numbers slowly dwindling along with the food supplies. But visitors continued to arrive. Apart from the occasional plane flying over, the zoo managed to escape most of what was happening in the outside world. But as the months dragged on and the war clearly wasn't going to end anytime soon, more and more staff members were dragged away, and eventually even Sir Garrard had to start getting his hands dirty again. And naturally, visitor numbers started to drop. Then, 12 months after Lizzie the elephant had arrived from Wales, she suffered a massive heart attack and passed away, with many at the time thinking that perhaps that long walk had actually been far, far too much for her to take. And as rationing continued in the wider county and country, criticism started being directed at the zoo for the amount of food that the animals were consuming, leading Sir Garrard to go to great lengths to prove to everybody that the food that his animals were eating was unfit for human consumption. It was leftovers, things that would usually end up on the mulch pile. And despite the criticism from those in the area, the zoo continued to be able to bring in this food, with the help of the Ministry of Agriculture, as the government was clearly keen that some form of entertainment be preserved during the war so that the public had something to do. During the summer of 1941, the zoo had an uncomfortable, direct encounter with the war that was happening all around it.
Let me introduce you to yet another kind of nondescript, not very interesting looking section of the park. But where I'm standing about here would have been the small mammal house. And it was around here that the zoo had the most direct reminder of what was happening everywhere else.
During a summer night, a bomb fell near one of the small animal houses and directly hit one of the aviaries that stood alongside it. And through sheer good fortune, all of the animals that were kept in that area had been removed not long before, which was of course a huge stroke of good fortune because that aviary building was completely destroyed, leaving only a crater where it had been.
It's always a little disappointing to know that a bomb fell somewhere in this neck of the woods and there's no massive crater. If you're familiar with the southeast of England and you've spent any time wandering around, you'll know that it is generally pockmarked with craters. I know most of my local parks were completely full of them. And a lot of that would have been from, doodlebugs coming down in Kent and Sussex. And a lot of that was also from German pilots who were dropping ordnance that they'd failed to get rid of over their targets. And so areas of Kent and the southeast like this kind of became just secondary accidental targets. So really, Maidstone Zoo, this whole area, got away pretty lightly.
But Maidstone Zoo would have one more very close shave. The Doodlebug was the German V1 flying bomb, a simple but innovative weapon that was used to terrorise England. And despite managing to avoid most of the action during, say, the Battle of Britain, Cobtree couldn't avoid the Doodlebug. Around August or September 1944, one came down on the zoo. We don't know the actual date it took place because wherever these came down, it tended to be kept very, very secret at the time. Now, apparently this Doodlebug fell into one of the trees that surrounded the lake near Chatham Road and broke all of the windows in the home of Captain Gates. Now, fortunately, no one was injured or killed by this Doodlebug, but one particularly unlucky gnu that was quite far away from where the bomb actually came down was killed when a random piece of shrapnel struck it at a great distance. And Sir Garrard, never one to miss an opportunity to have a joke or publicise his zoo, decided to hang one of the jagged pieces of Doodlebug shrapnel on the wall of the elephant house. He then painted the following text on the shrapnel. "This is a piece of the Doodlebug sent over by that horrid little man, Mr. Hitler, to try and blow up our house." Or at least, it read something like that. We don't really know because no one ever took a picture of it, and it was eventually lost. Now, it'd be remiss of me not to mention that Sir Garrard was a big fan of experimentation with his animals, and did try a lot of crossbreeding. He tried to produce something called a tigon, which is a cross between a tiger and a lioness, which leads me to believe that I guess a liger is a cross between a female tiger and a lion. You can let me know in the comments if there's any crossbreeding experts out there. He couldn't do that, but he did manage to breed a zebra with a donkey, leading to this wonderful creature we see before us, who clearly never really caught on, because you don't see many of these in 2026. Oh, this was also named a zebroid, so the name didn't really help it out much either. Amongst some of the larger animals at the zoo were the yaks. But of course, working with big animals usually has big risks. And Captain Gates found this out the hard way during the winter of 1943, when apparently he was in something of a hurry to get a yak into its sleeping quarters, and the animal didn't want to go to bed, and so charged at him. And all of this was witnessed by one Enid Basnet.
"I was working some distance away when I heard a yowl. I turned to see Captain Gates flying through the air, arms and legs in all directions like a rag doll. I rushed at the scene, fearful of what I might find, but discovered him picking himself up outside the compound with nothing worse than the bruised body and battered pride. The yak had tossed him right over the compound fence. It was probably fortunate that it did, for if he had fallen inside the fence and the animal had continued its attack, the results could have been very serious indeed."
You do wonder whether incidents like this were a bit of a result of both the animals and humans being a bit run down and stressed by the war. Everybody was hungry and tired. And I dare say the yak probably found a little satisfaction in being able to punt Captain Gates out of his enclosure. This wasn't the last big animal attack, because Enid Basnet and her colleague Dina Tanner found themselves confronted by the Cobtree camel. This camel had cleverly made his way out of his enclosure, seen the two girls walking about, and immediately charged at them. They, of course, immediately bolted as quickly as they could and found themselves in the parrot house. But the camel was not giving up that easily, proceeded to jam himself into the parrot house door. But fortunately for the girls, there was another door that they were able to leave through, at which point the camel calmed down but found himself well and truly stuck in the doorway. And eventually, after a lot of pushing and pulling, he was taken out and put back in his enclosure. When the zoo opened for the 1945 season, the effects of the war and the effects of rationing and staff shortages were really starting to have a bad impact. And it was in 1945 that feeding the carnivores in the zoo became a big problem. The zoo had no more old animals to slaughter. There were no pets left that were unwanted or too old or frail. And so it was in 1945 that Sir Garrard had to slaughter healthy animals. And for this task, he chose 2 of his treasured royal cream ponies. This was clearly a very difficult decision for a man who loved and adored all animals. But when it came down to losing the zoo's more exotic population, or some of the ponies who were always being born, the choice was depressingly straightforward. And if those ponies had not been put down to feed the rest of the animals, the general opinion is that most of the zoo's carnivores would have had to be put down as well. And it's a shame that it came to this right before the very end of the war. Although rationing was to continue for many frustrating years afterwards. But once the war in Europe ended on the 7th of May, supplies did slowly start to come back to normal. And despite those continued difficulties after the end of the war with rationing, a huge weight had been lifted off everyone. Staff members came back to work, and things slowly but surely started to return to normal. People could visit and relax without that heavy shadow of war hanging over them the entire time. And eventually, the 1945 season at the zoo ended with more than 100,000 visitors.
Well, tucked away in a nondescript corner of the park behind me here is the one other reminder of how things used to be. Now, from everything I've seen, this used to be a kind of a small pony paddock, llama paddock. Animals of that sort were kept in here. Now it's a little picnic area that is a bit tucked out of the way. I wonder how many people actually come down here. It's not much, but it's enough. You will find more spectacular ruins in your life. But again, there's something very, very poignant about standing somewhere and knowing that it's one of the few things left that represents what something used to be, what something used to mean to thousands of people. Again, though, look at the map. I'm not sure any of the members of the public here would have ever actually made it to this spot, because it looks like it was a bit out of the way. Again, like the orchard for the elephants, this might have just been a private little escape for some of the animals.
In September 1946, there was a huge gale, and one of the huge elm trees blew down and took out a fence around the wallaby enclosure. At which point Joey, the 3-year-old wallaby, immediately made his way out and made a beeline for Rochester. And before anyone really knew what had happened, he'd made it 8 miles away from the zoo, before being corralled into a garden by some children in Borstal. A lot of people at this point still had air raid shelters in their back gardens, and that's what they shut him in. And for the safe capture of Joey, his captor, a 14-year-old called Philip Butterworth, was given a free day out at the zoo. In November 1946, the zoo received perhaps its most important visitor. Princess Elizabeth, who of course would go on to become Her Majesty the Queen, arrived for a private tour of Maidstone Zoo. Huge efforts went into preparing the zoo, sweeping the paths to clear everything of leaves, repainting, retidying, every single thing. And by the time she arrived, the zoo was in pristine condition. Well, all of it, except for Wolf Wood. They decided that she probably wouldn't bother to go anywhere near the woods and they'd just walk around the enclosures and everything would be fine. But apparently the ever keen eye of young Princess Liz spotted a signpost to Wolf Wood, and apparently the prospect of real wolves was too much to pass up. And so Sir Garrard, who was leading her on this very personal tour of his very neat and tidy zoo, proceeded to take her into the, by his standards I'm sure, very messy woods. Although having looked at this picture here, it doesn't look that bad. It might not be a red carpet, but you know, I'd walk on that and have no complaints. And again, I guess I'm not the Queen. Now, it probably did irk Sir Garrard a little that there were no press to cover this, and he couldn't really use it as he may have wanted as a huge publicity stunt. But regardless, this was a huge get for the zoo, and definitely helped to put it on the map. Now, those of you that are familiar with this channel know that I've covered more than a few train accidents, and the miniature railway at Maidstone Zoo suffered one of its own. In April of 1948, the two coaches following the locomotive came off of the tracks, with two of the passengers suffering slight leg injuries. And that's it. That's really kind of all that happened. But they did close the railway for a few weeks to, check and see what had actually happened. The potential causes were kind of narrowed down to the rails might not have been properly ballasted and had spread apart, or there might have been something on the line. But unfortunately, no official report was ever published into the accident, so we'll never really know. And suffice it to say, there's not quite enough information for me to make a whole video about it. It was around this same period that new features started to be added to the zoo that kind of modernised it to some extent. Speakers were added around the park that played, the 1948 equivalent of elevator music. And apparently, south of the border down Mexico Way was one of the ones that was on repeat all the time. Down Mexico Way. Much to the possible irritation of the staff who always heard it. And there were also arcade machines added. Chiefly the ones we all know, those penny in the slot machines. And they were added to the Pets Corner, giving it, something more of an English seaside town arcade vibe. And whilst many at the time considered them what's been described as a little down market, they were also another source of revenue for the zoo. In 1949, head keeper George Thornycroft, who remember, had been working with Sir Garrard now for 35 years, only being separated during his service in the First World War, retired because of ill health. But he didn't go far because he lived on the estate, but his presence was apparently very missed. And sadly, a little over a year into his illness, George Thornycroft passed away. And Sir Garrard lost one of his oldest and most treasured colleagues, but also friends.
Now, I am stood as far down from the elephant house as I can possibly go, alongside the perimeter where Forstall Road is. And it is in this corner of what used to be the zoo that the racetrack stood.
The racetrack was added around 1950, 1951, and proved to be an instant success. There was an extra charge to get in, and it was walled off so that nobody could see what was happening from the outside, proving obviously a massive tease to the visitors who hadn't paid to go in there. Now, it was a very, very small dog track, nothing like the one down at Rochester, and they only had what was described as a motley collection of mongrel dogs that were kind of like terriers from Battersea Dogs Home. Now, people wouldn't actually bet on the dogs, but it became more of an exercise in finding out whether the dogs would even run in the right direction. And sometimes the dogs would just fight. But the racetrack proved that stress was probably worth it, because watchers would pay an extra 3p to come in and see it. And so again, the zoo had found another nice little earner for itself.
Now, if you can imagine this path going off behind me is the racetrack. It wasn't big, but there would have been a fence around it here. You would have paid, I can't remember what it was, 1-2 to come in. And in here, you would have witnessed small terrier-like dogs attempting to race each other, mainly fighting. I'd imagine Forstall Road behind me here wasn't quite as loud at the time.
It was also at the Racetrack where famous actor, comedian, producer and writer Richard Lewis Hearn, or rather his alter ego Mr. Pastry, would put on a bit of a show with the dogs, attempting to race them but usually ending up just falling over or forgetting which way to run. Richard Hearn was a good friend and acquaintance of Sir Garrard and was present for a huge number of the opening ceremonies for the zoo, usually performing as Mr. Pastry during these ceremonies. And Richard Hearn and his family were also present for the very last opening day of the zoo.
In some of the footage and the photos from the racetrack as well, you can see off in the background that it is just orchards. And if it was still just orchards, it might be slightly easier to kind of line up some old photographs, but it just doesn't exist anymore. I can stand roughly where these things were and try and line up the same angle that somebody had 60, 70 years ago, but they're just going to look nothing alike.
There was a sad turn of events in 1952. Daisy the elephant, who was now 22 years old, had a bit of a fright. Apparently a jet plane flew low and over the zoo, and Daisy, who was in the meadow behind the elephant house, apparently took off like a bullet. She immediately made a beeline for a perimeter fence and burst into the wood on the other side, with nothing stopping her until she reached a steep clay bank. Now Daisy, who was clearly just trying to get as far away as she possibly could in her fear, tried to climb up this bank, but of course failed, slid down to the bottom and was stuck on her side. Now, large animals who were stuck lying down or on the floor and can't get up, it can be a very, very serious situation, and especially so for elephants. And so efforts to raise her and get her back to the zoo became incredibly urgent. Some kind of winch setup was taken to the bank, and eventually they managed to winch her to her feet. But the moment she was upright again, she took off and continued to storm around the woods, accepting no help and being calmed by no one. And as the night got closer and closer, they were faced with a very, very difficult decision. Daisy, being outside the bounds of the zoo, was a danger to herself and to everyone else. And the risk of her just stampeding off into the countryside and eventually to villages and towns and into roads could not be taken. And the idea of guarding an elephant and keeping it in the woods all night was just not going to happen. And so it was decided that Daisy would have to be put down. And with that, Sir Garrard called for the guns to be brought. But just as the sun was going down and the light was fading, Daisy turned and quietly followed Captain Gates back to the elephant house, where she let him bed her down and went to sleep. Daisy would go on to pass away on May the 4th the following year. She was found lying on her side in the elephant house. There seemed to be no clear cause of death, and it was assumed that perhaps the episode the year before had simply been too stressful for an elephant her age. And with that, Sir Garrard probably felt like he'd lost another very old friend, and Gert had lost her partner in crime.
I am now definitely a little off the beaten track. This is definitely park. I've not wandered onto the golf course, but I'm pretty sure this is beyond where the actual zoo and the enclosures extended to. What it does go to show is, even though some zoologists scoffed and described this as the packing case zoo, and it definitely wasn't as big as some of its other rivals, like places like Port Limp, and there were bigger zoos around, but there is a lot of space here. So I'd obviously walking through the woods, not to think about Daisy running off into the woods when she had that scare, the wolves, the lions escaping and basically disappearing into the woods. Again,
hard to picture a stampeding elephant bursting out of the tree line behind me. But that did happen here.
In 1956, there was another escape with tragic consequences. During one of the winter breaks, a keeper forgot to fasten the cage for the lions, and two of the occupants, Caesar and Mary, wandered through the gate completely unseen. Sometime later, some of the other staff members spotted them roaming through the park, and immediately a capture crew was gathered. But lions are obviously tricky creatures and pretty independent, so this proved very, very difficult. And as it was winter and the light was fading very, very quickly, and apparently Mary was also just a bit bad-tempered in general, they again came to a sad conclusion. The lions could not be allowed to escape into the world outside the zoo, especially not in the middle of the night. And at the time there was no such thing as a tranquilizer dart. And so, after Sir Garrard had instructed them, a police marksman shot Mary. The first bullet, however, did not kill her, but lodged in her spine. And Winston Taylor and Yank Miller, two of the keepers, had to move in and put her out of her misery. The killing of Mary, of course, frightened Caesar, who quickly took off and hid in an outhouse. Fortunately, they managed to trap him in there, and Caesar was safely returned to his den.
This always makes me think of my portable time machine wish. I wish I could just click my fingers and open a portal into how it would have been at any point in history, and find that in places like this, everything just would completely transform around you. One of the reasons this is very difficult to make, because this place looks a lot different to how it did back in 1934 to 1959, is because in 1980, 1981, they tried to turn this into an arboretum. So they planted hundreds of different species of trees here, with the intent being that they wanted to kind of create, Kent's own Kew Gardens. Now, I don't think it, clearly never really turned into a Kew Gardens rival, but obviously it completely transformed the landscape here. There were trees and there was wolf wood, obviously, in this kind of general area. So some of this would have been here, but there would have been a lot more clearings and nowhere near the variety of trees and plants there are now. If you want to look at it in a kind of sad way, it's maybe just another example of how this place never really stuck at being one thing. It couldn't remain a zoo, and it never really caught on as an arboretum. And maybe ultimately the thing that it will stick with is just being a nice little country park. And hey, if you want to pull way out, then maybe what this place has remained successful in is just being somewhere to go and relax.
In 1957, there was a huge outbreak of polio in Maidstone and Kent. And in almost an earlier example of what was going to happen, many decades later in 2020, people were encouraged to avoid contact with others as much as possible, with events and gatherings being cancelled across the county. And of course, despite no polio being evident at the zoo, it saw a huge fall in visitors. Around this same time, Sir Garrard was facing a lot of trouble trying to bring new animals into the zoo. Animal prices had gotten incredibly out of hand compared to what they'd been in the zoo's early years. And since the war, animal prices had essentially doubled. All except for the cost of bears, apparently, because I think bears were generally seen as just being a bit too difficult to look after anyway, so people were more keen to just get a bear off of their hands than overprice someone for one.
Something I will say, as nice as this all is, and there's a lot of nice kind of sculptures around the place, this is clearly an art trail. It'd be nice if it was a little more directly related to what used to be here. I don't know what this is, beyond, maybe just the most elaborate, uncomfortable bench I've ever seen. From a distance, I thought this was a shark's mouth. It's actually the cut out of a leaf, which makes a lot more sense, but I don't know, you can kind of see shark's mouth, right? It's not just me.
I'd like to see sculptures that are a little bit more animal themed, shall we say. And also, I think a really nice touch, and maybe it's just completely out of the question now, but it'd be such a nice touch to, in some way, whether it was through signs or tiles or a brick path or, just something to indicate the old outline of the zoo and the enclosures that used to be here.
At the end of 1957, it was clear that the zoo needed a lot of work. Things were starting to get a bit run down, facilities had not been looked after for some time, and Sir Garrard, who had just turned 76, was clearly starting to feel his age and was less keen than ever to spend money and invest in the zoo's upkeep and expansion. But the zoo carried on, people continued to arrive. Sir Garrard was unfortunately taken ill for the 1958 opening of the zoo, and so couldn't attend, so it was somewhat of a smaller occasion, but everything continued pretty much as normal, just maybe a little rough around the edges. But in September 1959, a now 78-year-old Sir Garrard called a press conference and announced that it was time for the zoo to close. His age and illness meant that he just didn't have the energy to commit anymore, and added to the fact that he basically lived at the zoo, he said he simply couldn't bear to see it carry on under somebody else whilst he was right there. And so his only solution, having no heir to pass it on to, was to close. And so instead of closing down that season for maintenance and expansion, the zoo was quietly wrapped up.
As much as I've been wandering around going, there's nothing left, how sad is that? If you know what you're looking for, I know it's a big if, but if you know what you're looking for, if you're somewhere and you know the history, you know what used to be there, you can find the signs. This trip has been evidence that with a little foreknowledge, you can pick out little hints here and there, little clues that tell you that things weren't always as they currently seem. It's a sign that, history never really goes away, it just fades. But there's always something, there's always some little clue, whether that's just in the landscape or in a small piece of architecture somewhere, or just the way something's been laid out. Just there are these tiny little clues just buried in the environment around us that tell us the story of a place. I know this is all kind of, History 101, but History 101 is very interesting.
The gates of Maidstone Zoo closed for the last time on Sunday, the 4th of October, 1959. Some of the animals were moved to other zoos in the country, where they were quite nicely provided with plaques explaining exactly where they'd come from.
And some of the animals, namely the axis deer, hog deer and nilgai antelopes, were actually bought by John Aspinall and brought to his zoos Port Limp and Beaksbourne. And here we are at Port Limp with possibly some of the great ancestors of those deer and antelope that were at Maidstone Zoo.
Sir Garrard did keep his llamas though, and of course his Royal Cream ponies. He was never going to give up all his animals now, was he? Gert was actually bought by Sir Billy Butlin, and in the storied history of elephants moving from Wales to Kent and back, moved to a Butlins in North Wales. Here she was called Gertie. Then she was shifted to another Butlins in Skegness, and then again to one in Lincolnshire where she was renamed Gertrude, which all must have been incredibly confusing for Gert. But, and this is incredibly tragic, Gertie passed away in Skegness. She'd been taken out for a walk in the Butlins camp and had decided to pop into one of the swimming pools. But the base was unfortunately not strong enough to support the weight of a fully grown elephant, and she collapsed through it. They attempted to drain the pool of water as quickly as they possibly could, but her keeper just wasn't able to keep her head above water whilst that was done. And so Gert the elephant drowned in that pool. And Vicky Harris says it perfectly in her book, that Gert didn't deserve to die such a horrible death when she'd given pleasure to tens of thousands of children and adults and had harmed no one.
Now, of course, at this point in the story you'll realise that I've never mentioned children, at least not for Sir Garrard and Lady Edna, and they didn't have any. And so there was a huge question about what they were going to do with their estate, their land, everything when they passed away. But what they did was incredibly generous. In keeping with the spirit of, sharing their land and their animals with everybody, they set up the Cobtree Charity Trust. Essentially what that meant was that their entire estate, all of their grounds, around, almost 300 acres of land, should only ever be used for the benefit of the people of Maidstone. Which is in large part why, instead of just losing this to another housing estate, we have the lovely country park that we see here today.
Sir Garrard Tyrwhitt-Drake eventually passed away in October 1964 at the age of 83.
And here he is. Not one of the hardest graves to find, this one. In fact, I drove past it on the way in. This is the final resting place of Sir Garrard and Lady Edna. And if I've got my information correct, the two lions either side were actually the lions that adorn the entrance to the driveway to Cobtree Manor whilst they lived there. It's interesting. We focused, obviously, of course, so much on the zoo in this video, but there's so much more to this man's life. We didn't even touch on the Maidstone Carriage Museum, which he established. We didn't touch on the fact that he was the High Sheriff of the county. We didn't really touch on his mayoral career, and we obviously barely scratched the surface of what he did with Style and Winch. And that just shows you that whilst we've covered what I think is probably what I can describe it cheesily as the core of the man, I think obviously, the zoo and his animals, his collection was clearly probably the biggest glimpse at, what made the real man tick. But the rest of his life was also committed to public service. And yes, he was obviously from a position of great privilege, and we can't ignore certain things, like it was a small zoo, and the way we know how to look after and care for exotic animals now has changed a lot for the better. What has really stood out from making this video is that deep down commitment to public service, to providing a place and experience for the people of Maidstone, the people of Kent, somewhere they could come to relax and enjoy sights that they wouldn't see every day. And that also shines through in how him and Lady Edna decided to use their property, their land, once they passed away, and how it's still being used today. And ultimately, this was a man who, it is quite clear, cared about his people and his animals above all else. We'll leave the valid discussion of whether it was the best way to look after and care for these animals and whether they actually had the space they needed, all very valid. This story is really focusing on the intent and the story of Maidstone Zoo, and both of those things, I think, hold a lot of merit. This was undoubtedly a man who cared deeply. Before I forget, there was one more cemetery I was trying to find. Here it is. I found it. It's not exactly where I thought it was. It definitely wasn't where I was looking before. But after scouring the internet and finding out it was kind of, somewhere along the perimeter next to the golf course, I managed to find it. It's actually nearer to the house, really, than anything, which I think tells you a lot about how Sir Garrard and how his staff felt about these animals. The fact that they are buried just alongside Sir Garrard's home just shows you how near and dear all of these animals were to him. And obviously these are quite old, but from what I've been able to make out, the dates range from 1933-ish straight through to, I mean, I'm seeing graves up there from 1970, so after Sir Garrard had passed away. So it seems like this is a tradition that probably carried on for as long as Sir Garrard was here and for a little bit after as well. Now, I don't recognise any of the names on these, but for this entire video I've been talking about how, you know, the zoo is gone. There are barely any relics left over from it, apart from things like the elephant house. But actually here is the closest we will get to finding the real heart of what used to be here, the final resting place for what really mattered in the zoo, the animals. Well, that was a bit of an epic. I hope you found this interesting. I personally love coming to places and seeing just how much things have changed in ultimately what is not really a very long period of time. It's always incredible how much different things can be. Although I'm always in danger of sounding like my granddad. Well, this all used to be fields. He didn't sound like that.
A huge shout out as well to Vicky Harris. Without her incredibly detailed book on the history of Maidstone Zoo, this video definitely wouldn't have been possible. I managed to find a good quality second-hand copy out there on World of Books, I think it was, so if you're interested in finding out even more detail about this, make sure to go out and see if you can find a copy of this book, because it's well worth it.
If you have any suggestions for other lost places like this that I can go and visit, then feel free to mention them down in the comments, because give me suggestions. I love taking suggestions from viewers and finding out more about our local history. If you have enjoyed this, remember to like the video. That massively helps out how many people end up seeing these. And subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. That would be amazing, and I would be forever grateful for your support. So, on that note, from me and Gert and Daisy and the ghosts of all the animals that used to be here, I'll see you in the next one.